Hello and welcome back to NPA Discovery, where we dive deep into the lives of music's greatest legends, their triumphs, their tragedies, and the truths behind the myths. Today's story is about Glenn Frey, the engine behind the Eagles, the voice and vision that shaped an entire era of American rock. His journey wasn't just about music. It was about ambition, reinvention, family, and the inevitable struggles that come when dreams meet reality. The title of today's video says it all: Glenn Frey, the rise, the fall, and the legacy behind the Eagles. Do I agree with that title? Absolutely. Because Glenn Frey wasn't just another member of the Eagles, he was, in many ways, the architect of their sound, the storyteller behind their hits, and the restless soul who kept pushing them higher, even when it came at great personal cost. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow music lovers, and subscribe to the channel. Every click helps us keep telling the stories that deserve to be remembered. Now, let's begin where every legend begins, at the start. Glenn Louis Frey was born in Detroit, Michigan, in November 1948. And if you know anything about Detroit in the mid-20th century, you'll know it was a city humming with two things: cars and music. This was the era when Motown Records was just across town, when the Temptations, Marvin Gaye, and the Supremes were redefining what American music could be. Detroit wasn't just a car factory hub, it was a music factory. And that rhythm seeped into Frey's veins from the very beginning. But here's the thing about Glenn Frey: his future could have gone in any direction. He wasn't destined from birth to be a rock star. He was a reader, fascinated by writers like Jack Kerouac, whose restless energy spoke to his own curiosity about life. He was an athlete, small in size but filled with competitive fire. He was a piano student, pushed by his parents toward classical discipline. And yet, somehow, all those roads converged into music. Writing, storytelling, competition, performance, everything he loved eventually found its way into his guitar, his lyrics, and his career. Unlike many of his peers who drifted into music casually, Glenn Frey carried himself with the kind of intensity usually reserved for poets and novelists. That was his secret weapon. He didn't just want to write catchy songs. He wanted to tell stories. He wanted to write characters. He wanted his songs to feel like mini-movies, where every lyric painted a scene. Think about Hotel California. That wasn't just a song. It was a screenplay, a Twilight Zone story told in 5 minutes of melody. That gift came from his early obsession with writers like Kerouac, James Dean's rebel attitude, and the raw storytelling power of American culture. But let's get real: as much as Glenn loved books, there was one thing that truly lit the fire under him: girls. At 16, Frey realized that if you wanted to get attention from girls in the mid-1960s, you didn't bring a book of poetry to the dance, you brought a guitar. And when he saw the Beatles take over the world in 1964, it wasn't just inspiring, it was a revelation. He said to himself, that's what I want to do. So the piano was pushed aside. The guitar became his weapon of choice. And with it, Frey began his first experiments in local Detroit bands, bouncing from group to group, learning how to perform, how to command an audience, how to look like a rock star before he even fully sounded like one. This is where real life gives us a lesson: greatness often doesn't begin with destiny. It begins with desire. Glenn Frey didn't start out as the best guitarist, or the best singer. What he had was hunger, and the confidence to follow it, wherever it led. And fate, as it often does, intervened. In 1967, still just a teenager, Frey crossed paths with another Detroit native who was also clawing his way up the music ladder: Bob Seger. Now here's where things get fascinating. Seger wasn't just a friend or a mentor. He was the gateway. He took Frey under his wing, helped him land a record deal, and even gave him a chance to sing backup on Seger's breakout hit, Ramblin' Gamblin' Man. That track was Glenn Frey's first taste of real success. He could feel the crowd's energy, hear the song on the radio, and realize, this isn't just a dream. This can be my life. And here's the lesson you and I can take from this: never underestimate the power of mentors. Without Bob Seger, there may never have been an Eagles. But Frey's road wasn't a straight line. Just as he prepared to join Seeger's band full-time, his mother intervened. She caught him smoking with other musicians and flatly refused to let her teenage son dive into the full chaos of rock and roll. At first glance, that might seem like a roadblock. But in hindsight, it was exactly what Frey needed. Because when he turned 19, free from parental restrictions, he had even more fire to chase his dream. This is something that echoes across the lives of many legends, sometimes the setbacks, the restrictions, even the people who tell you, no, they don't stop you. They sharpen you. And Glenn Frey? He was getting sharper by the day. By the late 1960s, one decision changed everything. Glenn Frey left Detroit and headed west. Why? Because of a girl. Of course. His high school sweetheart had moved to Los Angeles, and Frey followed her. He wanted to win her back. He didn't. But instead, he found something much bigger, a city overflowing with possibility. LA in 1970 wasn't just Hollywood. It was the breeding ground for a new kind of rock music, country rock, folk rock, and the sound that would become the Eagles. Frey didn't know it yet, but he was about to meet the collaborators who would change not just his life, but the sound of American music forever. When Glenn Frey arrived in Los Angeles in the late 1960s, he wasn't walking into stardom. He was walking into a city bursting with dreamers. Los Angeles, at that time, was like a giant magnet pulling in musicians from every corner of the country. Sunset Boulevard, Laurel Canyon, the Troubadour Club, these weren't just neighborhoods and venues. They were incubators, places where artists tested themselves, battled obscurity, and, if they were lucky, forged legends. For every star who broke through, there were 100 who disappeared. And Glenn Frey could have easily been one of those 100. But he wasn't. Why? Because Glenn Frey didn't just play music. He studied it. He worked at it. He was relentless. Here's where luck meets preparation. When Frey moved into an apartment building in Echo Park, he just happened to live one floor above a rising singer-songwriter named Jackson Browne. At the time, Browne was already respected for his songwriting, meticulous, detailed, emotional. And every morning, Glenn Frey would wake up and hear something that changed his life. It wasn't the finished product. It wasn't the applause. It was the work. Jackson Browne would play a single verse over and over, tweaking one chord, shifting one word, repeating the same line 100 times until it was perfect. Glenn Frey would later say, "That's when I got it. That's how you do it. That's how you write songs." Up until then, Frey thought songwriting was inspiration. Browne showed him it was discipline. And that lesson, the grind, the craftsmanship, became the cornerstone of Frey's entire career. This is something every creative person can relate to. Talent gets you started. But craft, the willingness to do it over and over until it's right, that's what separates amateurs from professionals. But lessons alone weren't enough. Los Angeles was still a competition. And the heart of that competition was the Troubadour, a small nightclub on Santa Monica Boulevard that became the launch pad for an entire generation of artists. The Troubadour wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, it was crowded, and it was brutally honest. If you walked on that stage and you weren't good enough, the audience let you know. If you were great, word spread instantly. This was the world Glenn Frey threw himself into. He wasn't the biggest star on that stage, not yet. But he was watching, learning, networking. The Troubadour wasn't just a club. It was a classroom, and one of the classmates he kept bumping into was another hungry young musician from Texas, Don Henley. Now, let's pause for a second. Because if you know music history, you know this is the moment everything changes. Don Henley and Glenn Frey were complete opposites in some ways. Henley was the perfectionist, the poet, the serious craftsman. Frey was the talker, the hustler, the one with vision and fire. Together, they were dynamite. And the match that lit the fuse came in the form of Linda Ronstadt. In 1971, both Frey and Henley were recruited to back up Linda Ronstadt on tour. And if you're wondering why that matters, here's why. Linda Ronstadt wasn't just a star. She was a star maker. She had an eye for talent, and she gave young musicians a chance to grow under her spotlight. On that tour, Frey and Henley clicked in a way that neither could ignore. They had chemistry, musically, creatively, personally. And when the tour ended, they made a decision: they weren't going to keep backing up other stars. They were going to be the stars. So, along with guitarist Bernie Leadon and bassist Randy Meisner, Frey and Henley formed a new band. A band that blended country harmonies, rock rhythms, and folk storytelling. They called themselves the Eagles. It's funny looking back now, because we all know how big they became. But in 1971, the Eagles were just another new band in a crowded city, fighting for a record deal. Still, Glenn Frey had something most musicians didn't: vision. He could see where this band could go. He believed they could craft a sound that was bigger than the Troubadour, bigger than Los Angeles, something that captured the restless, wandering spirit of America itself. And he wasn't wrong. Here's where I want to step back and give my opinion. Because the Eagles weren't just another successful band. They were a phenomenon. Why? Because they hit a cultural nerve. In the early 1970s, America was coming out of the chaos of the 60s, Vietnam, protests, assassinations, disillusionment. People were searching for a soundtrack that felt both comforting and free, something that reflected the open road and the American dream, but with enough grit to feel real. That's what the Eagles delivered. Songs like "Take It Easy" weren't just catchy, they were anthems for an entire generation that wanted to escape, to drive, to believe in something simple and beautiful again. And Glenn Frey, more than anyone, was the voice pushing that message forward. He was the guy saying, "We're going to make this work. We're going to own this sound." By 1972, the Eagles released their debut album. It was packed with the kind of songs that instantly connected: "Take It Easy," "Witchy Woman," "Peaceful Easy Feeling." The harmonies were flawless. The guitar work was sharp. The lyrics painted pictures. And at the center of it all was Glenn Frey, not always as the lead singer, but always as the driving force. This was just the beginning. But it was already clear, the Eagles weren't just another band. They were on a trajectory that would take them higher than anyone imagined. By the mid-1970s, the Eagles were no longer just another Los Angeles band. They had become a national force. Their blend of country harmonies, California rock, and radio-friendly hooks turned them into one of the biggest acts in America almost overnight. But success doesn't just create fame. It creates pressure. And inside the Eagles, that pressure was starting to build. When "Take It Easy" hit the airwaves in 1972, it wasn't just a song. It was a statement. Written by Jackson Browne and finished by Glenn Frey, it captured something quintessentially American: a guy on the road, chasing freedom, chasing love, shrugging off life's problems with a smile. It was catchy. It was optimistic. It was everything radio wanted. And with that, the Eagles had their first hit. Follow-ups like "Witchy Woman" and "Peaceful Easy Feeling" cemented the band as leaders of the emerging country rock scene. But Glenn Frey wasn't satisfied. To him, these weren't just songs. They were stepping stones. He wanted the Eagles to be bigger, not just popular, but legendary. Here's the thing about Glenn Frey. He wasn't just a songwriter or a singer. He was a visionary. Frey saw the Eagles as more than a band. He saw them as a brand, a sound, an image, a lifestyle. And he pushed relentlessly to make that vision real. He once said, "I was the guy who said, we've got to have hit records. We've got to get on the radio." Don Henley was the poet. I was the pragmatist. That balance, Henley's depth and Frey's drive, was the engine that powered the Eagles, but it also created friction. As the band's popularity grew, so did the expectations. Record labels demanded hits. Audiences demanded perfection. And Glenn Frey demanded nothing less than excellence from everyone around him. He wasn't easy to work with. Former bandmates have admitted that Frey could be blunt, stubborn, even ruthless. But here's the paradox: without that intensity, the Eagles might never have reached the heights they did. Every harmony, every guitar riff, every lyric had to be just right. And when you listen to those records today, you can hear it, that obsessive craftsmanship. Still, the pressure cooker atmosphere was starting to take its toll. But even as Glenn Frey built a new life, the shadow of the Eagles never left him. Fans never stopped asking about a reunion. Journalists never stopped bringing it up. And the one person he couldn't escape, no matter how much he wanted to, was Don Henley. The two had barely spoken since the Eagles' breakup. Both carried grudges. Both had said harsh words about the other in interviews. Henley once joked that the Eagles would reunite when hell freezes over. But deep down, both men knew the Eagles were unfinished business. The 1990s a shifting landscape. By the early 1990s, something unexpected happened. Classic rock had come back in style. MTV was running retrospectives. Radio stations were branding themselves as classic rock and playing the Eagles non-stop. A new generation of fans was discovering Hotel California for the first time. Suddenly, there was money, a lot of money, to be made if the Eagles ever got back together. And slowly, painfully, Frey and Henley began to thaw. In 1994, the impossible happened. Glenn Frey and Don Henley, after 14 years of silence and bitterness, agreed to reunite the Eagles. The tour was jokingly called Hell Freezes Over, a nod to Henley's old quip. But it wasn't just a reunion. It was a resurrection. The Eagles played to sold-out arenas, proving that not only had their music endured, it had grown even larger in their absence. The MTV special Hell Freezes Over became a cultural event, with the band performing stripped-down versions of classics alongside new material. For Glenn Frey, it was vindication. He had survived the breakup, thrived as a solo artist, dabbled in acting, but in the end, he was back where he belonged. Front and center with the Eagles. Glenn Frey's post-Eagles years tell us something important about him. He wasn't content to rest on his past success. He wasn't going to fade into nostalgia. Instead, he adapted. He embraced the 1980s sound. He jumped into television and film. He built a solo career that stood on its own merits. And then, when the time was right, he helped engineer one of the greatest reunions in rock history. It speaks to his resilience, his ambition, and his belief in himself. Because while Don Henley might have been the voice of the Eagles, Glenn Frey was always the engine.